What if Africa just pulled the rug from under France's feet, and no one saw it coming? What if the world's most exploited continent has been quietly building its power, and the moment has finally arrived to force the colonial giants to pack up and leave forever? Can you imagine a future where the West isn't calling the shots anymore? Where Africa writes its destiny and tells France to get out? Could this be the turning point in history we've all been waiting for? Or just another hollow political statement? Maybe it's time to stop questioning if Africa is rising and start wondering why we didn't see it coming. Let's get started. For decades, the West has treated Africa like a little brother in a geopolitical sense. Western countries have had their hands in Africa's pie, running the show, and making sure that the resources kept flowing in their direction. And they've done this under the guise of helping Africa's development. But let's be real. When was the last time Africa got a fair deal out of these so-called partnerships? Never. Senegal is showing the world exactly what happens when a country refuses to stay quiet anymore. They've seen enough of France's so-called protection. Instead, they're taking control of their destiny. And if you think this is just a small, isolated act, think again. Senegal is starting a movement, and they're not alone. Countries like Mali, Burkina Faso, and several others have already rejected French military presence. Senegal just got loud enough to make the West squirm. And why not? Africa doesn't need any more help from former colonizers. The so-called help has only harmed. It's time for African nations to stand on their own and make the rules. So why is Senegal saying enough is enough? Let's dive into the heart of the matter. The Thiaroye Massacre, a piece of history that has never truly been addressed. The Thiaroye Massacre stands as one of the most glaring examples of the deep betrayal that continues to shape Africa's fraught relationship with France. To understand its significance, we need to step back into the turbulent years of World War II. During this period, thousands of African soldiers, many of whom had fought bravely alongside French forces, were betrayed by the very country they had risked their lives for. These men, who had marched into battle under the French flag, hoping for recognition and respect in return for their sacrifices, were instead met with cold brutality. In 1944, in the remote town of Thiaroye, French forces executed hundreds of these African soldiers, leaving their bodies in the streets, a brutal testament to the harsh reality of colonial promises. These soldiers had fought for France, believing they would be honored for their service. But instead, they were discarded when their usefulness had expired. The Thiaroye Massacre wasn't just a tragic military event. It was an enduring symbol of the colonial cruelty that France imposed on its African subjects. For many Africans, this massacre represents the ultimate betrayal, a betrayal that continues to echo through generations. What makes this massacre particularly chilling is that it wasn't an isolated incident but part of a larger pattern of exploitation, neglect, and violence inflicted by France during its colonial rule. The French government's failure to properly acknowledge this massacre and the subsequent lack of meaningful reparations has only deepened the wound. For the people of Senegal and beyond, this was more than just a dark chapter in history. It was a constant reminder of the power dynamics that have shaped their relationship with France. And now, after years, France has acknowledged this. But the Thiaroye Massacre is not the only incident that has contributed to Africa's collective memory of French betrayal. If we zoom out to the broader picture of France's colonial empire, we begin to see a recurring theme of violence, exploitation, and betrayal, a pattern that has shaped the modern demands for France's exit from the continent. One such example is the Algerian War of Independence from 1954 to 1962, a conflict that encapsulates the brutality of French colonialism at its peak. Algeria, once seen as an integral part of France, was determined to break free. The French response was nothing short of barbaric. In one of the most brutal wars of decolonization, hundreds of thousands of Algerians were killed, their villages destroyed, and their bodies left to rot in the streets. The French military employed massacres and repression as tactics to quash the Algerian independence movement. The scale of the violence was staggering, and it deeply scarred not only the Algerian people, but also other African nations watching the horrors unfold. The Algerian War of Independence revealed the depths of France's desire to maintain control over its colonies, no matter the human cost. This wasn't just about protecting French interests. It was about asserting dominance, even through terror. The war's aftermath left an indelible mark on the entire African continent. For many African nations, the bloody tactics of France in Algeria became a warning. Colonialism's scars were far from healed, and the violence of the past continued to affect the present. It became clear that France's commitment to helping its African colonies had always been about exploiting them, keeping them under its thumb for as long as possible. As countries across Africa gained independence in the 1960s, many of them, like Senegal, began to question why they should remain entangled with a country that had shown such ruthless disregard for African lives. Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. There was the assassination of Patrice Lumumba, the first prime minister of the newly independent Democratic Republic of the Congo. Lumumba, a charismatic leader who sought to unite and empower his people, was seen by the West as a threat. His vision of a united, independent Africa, free from foreign control, clashed with the geopolitical ambitions of European powers, particularly France and Belgium. France played a critical role in his overthrow by backing the coup that resulted in his brutal murder. Lumumba's assassination wasn't just an individual loss, it was a loss for the entire African continent. His death symbolized the lengths to which former colonial powers were willing to go to maintain their influence over African nations, even in the face of democratic self-determination. For many African leaders, the murder of Lumumba cemented the belief that France and other former colonial powers were not interested in real African autonomy. They were interested in controlling the continent, either through military intervention or by propping up puppet regimes that served their interests. And so, the desire for true independence grew stronger across Africa, with many nations turning their backs on France and seeking to chart their course, free from the influence of former colonizers. The Lumumba assassination became a rallying cry for those who believed Africa's path to sovereignty could only be achieved by cutting ties with its colonial past. France's interventionist tactics didn't stop in the 1960s, nor did the resentment toward its military presence. In 2013, when insurgent groups took control of northern Mali, France once again intervened militarily under the guise of protecting the region from insurgents. Operation Serval was portrayed as a humanitarian mission, aimed at stabilizing the region and ensuring the security of the African people. But let's be honest, this intervention had more to do with France's desire to maintain influence in its former colonies than with fighting insurgency. Senegal and many other African nations saw this as another instance of France trying to keep its claws in the region. Despite the military help, many Malians, along with the wider African community, were skeptical of France's intentions. Mali's relationship with France, like many other African countries, has been defined by distrust and resentment. The lingering presence of French military bases across the continent, disguised as peacekeeping forces, continues to stoke anger and fuel movements for independence. For countries like Senegal, the decision to expel French forces is not just a political act. It's a rejection of a history built on betrayal, violence, and exploitation. It's a statement that African nations are ready to stand on their own, and that they will not tolerate foreign intervention that undermines their sovereignty. This history, the Thiaroye massacre, the Algerian War, the assassination of Lumumba, and France's ongoing military presence, has built up a powerful collective memory across Africa. It is this history that drives the demand for France's expulsion from African soil. African nations like Senegal have had enough. No more military bases, no more manipulation. It's time for Africa to take control of its future, free from the shackles of colonial powers that have long been allowed to meddle in their affairs. France's time on the continent is running out. But if you're thinking, there's no way kicking out France's military forces won't affect the economy, you're not alone in wondering how a nation can survive without the backing of a foreign superpower. But Senegal has a plan. And it's not just a pipe dream, it's a carefully calculated move. One of the most critical aspects of Senegal's ability to thrive without a French military presence is its growing focus on economic diversification. For years, African countries have been under the thumb of colonial powers like France, whose military bases and economic ties were more about exploiting resources than fostering real development. However, Senegal is charting a new course by strengthening ties with alternative partners like China and other emerging economies. By severing the economic dependency on France, Senegal is free to explore more mutually beneficial partnerships that are based on respect and fairness. China, in particular, has emerged as a major economic partner for many African nations, offering infrastructure projects, trade agreements, and investment in key sectors like technology, manufacturing, and energy, without the strings attached that France often demands. Senegal has been quietly working on these relationships for years, ensuring that when it made the move to expel French troops, it had already secured alternative sources of trade, investment, and diplomatic support. Senegal's relationship with China exemplifies how African nations don't need the military presence of a former colonizer to be economically successful. While France has often tied economic aid and trade deals to the presence of military forces on the continent, China has largely focused on investment and infrastructure, key factors that enable African countries to stand on their own 2 feet without foreign interference. Senegal's economy is now increasingly integrated into the global marketplace, with expanding trade agreements, robust infrastructure projects, and the promise of future growth driven by partnerships that prioritize economic self-determination. Senegal is investing in its resources, diversifying away from reliance on French industries, and empowering local industries to take the lead in sectors like agriculture, technology, and manufacturing. This economic shift is paving the way for long-term stability and prosperity, something that would have been unimaginable if the country had remained under France's shadow. For too long, African nations were seen as pawns in the geopolitical chess game of European powers. French military bases, economic influence, and political interference in Africa's affairs were part of a broader strategy to keep the continent in a state of dependency. Senegal's decision to demand France's military withdrawal is not just a rejection of military control. It's a bold assertion of political autonomy. With France no longer on its soil, Senegal is free to pursue its political vision without the threat of foreign intervention. African countries have long been at the mercy of foreign interests, especially when it comes to foreign military forces that have been used to install puppet regimes and manipulate national politics. In Senegal's case, the desire for self-governance and sovereignty will be more achievable than ever. By expelling French military forces, the country is regaining control over its political destiny, something that will inevitably benefit the people of Senegal. But this isn't just about rejecting France. It's about setting a precedent for other African nations that are also looking for ways to reclaim their sovereignty and build political systems that reflect the will of their people, not the interests of foreign powers. Senegal's actions are a call to action for other nations to do the same, to reassert control over their futures and reject the manipulation that has often come from former colonial powers. Senegal's rejection of French military presence isn't just political or economic, it's cultural too. For years, the continent's colonial past has shaped how African nations view their own identity. Many African countries, under the influence of former colonizers, were pushed to abandon their own cultures and adopt Western ideals. Senegal, in rejecting France, is asserting its right to celebrate and nurture its cultural heritage, without the baggage of colonial history hanging over its head. This cultural shift is important because it empowers Senegal's people to reclaim their African identity. It sends a clear message: Africa's rich cultural history, traditions, and languages have inherent value. Senegal is positioning itself as a leader in this cultural renaissance, embracing its African roots and showing the world that it does not need Western validation to succeed. This cultural movement is gaining momentum across the continent. As more African nations push back against colonial influence, they are rediscovering the power of their traditions, languages, and history, which were suppressed under colonial rule. Senegal's rejection of French military bases is a symbol of the broader African struggle to reclaim cultural pride and self-determination. The idea that African nations need former colonizers to survive economically, politically, or culturally is a myth that has long been propagated by Western powers. Senegal's refusal to continue that narrative is a bold challenge to a long-standing geopolitical status quo. By stepping away from France's military influence, Senegal is seizing its independence in all areas of life, economically, politically, and culturally. The reality is that Senegal is not just surviving without France, it's thriving without it. The country's focus on building independent economic partnerships, asserting political autonomy, and celebrating its African identity will lay the foundation for a more prosperous, self-sufficient future. Senegal is now free to pursue a future that reflects its values, needs, and aspirations, without the interference of colonial powers. And this is a message that resonates not only in Senegal, but across the entire African continent. And what happens with France after being thrown out? When Senegal throws France out, it's not just a political move, it's the realization of a dream. For Senegal, it's like watching the chains of colonial history break apart and finally being able to breathe. The dream of true sovereignty, of never having to bow to foreign powers again, becomes reality. Senegal's independence, which was once symbolic and incomplete, becomes whole. It's a powerful statement to the world that Africa's time has come, and that the exploitation and dominance of the past are no longer acceptable. For Senegal, this moment is about reclaiming dignity, power, and respect on its terms. But what does it mean for France? This is a blow to their pride, their history, and their global influence. For decades, France has seen itself as the mother of many African nations, holding them in its economic and political orbit, exploiting resources and keeping a tight grip on former colonies through neo-colonial tactics. Senegal's move to expel France would shatter this carefully constructed facade. It forces France to face the uncomfortable truth. The era of imperial control is over, and their grip on Africa is slipping. This isn't just a political loss for France. It's a symbolic death of an empire. The realization that the very countries they once controlled are now turning away, refusing to be part of a system built on exploitation, is an existential crisis for France. It challenges their identity, both as a former colonial power and as a leading player in global politics. For France, losing Senegal, a key player in West Africa, would signal the end of an era of dominance and force them to rethink their place in the world. This isn't just about losing influence, it's about losing face. France has built its international image on its ability to maintain order in Africa, but if a country like Senegal stands up and says no, it sends a powerful message to the rest of the world that Africa is no longer willing to be controlled. It could spark a chain reaction, encouraging other African nations to follow suit, further undermining France's position on the global stage. This isn't a mere political setback. It's a reckoning that France never saw coming. So, do you think France can survive without Africa? What will happen if Africa cuts France off completely? Let us know in the comments section. Will France stay out of Africa before it is completely thrown out? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.